The Debt Collector's Story, a short story by Neil M. Thorne. It was by no means a noble profession, but the debt collector enjoyed his job. It earned him a fearsome reputation, which he used well to his advantage, and in his time had heard all the reasons why payment could not be made. Like anyone in this world, he worked for others, and so saw no reason why people could not make ends meet. Secretly, though, he enjoyed this power, and delighted in seeing their fear at his arrival. Just that morning, after seeing a family evicted from their home, he was asked to take on a round of additional cases. It was easy going, and took him late into the evening, until eventually there was only one final collection to be made. The notes read she was always trouble, and true to form, once the door was opened, the excuses freely flowed. With work hours reduced and an unexpected bill, she could barely afford to feed herself, let alone make payment as promised. He was unsympathetic, and warned that with such a poor record the bailiffs would not be held off long. It was usually enough to make them cough up, but on this occasion she truly had nothing, and so he prepared, almost with relish, to put a mark against her name. Wait! Now desperate, she asked whether there was anything else he could possibly want instead, and to this he just smiled. It was often the last resort of a woman with no other choice, and many others would naturally take advantage of such an offer, but this was not his way. He placed no judgment on however she chose to make money, just so long as she paid. The suggestion, however, offended, which left him confused, for beyond in her meagre apartment there was nothing of material wealth that would even amount to a single payment, and so he asked, what else could she pay with? A story, she offered, to which he just laughed, for how could that even hope to suffice? But amused by the idea, instead asked, what sort of story? A journey, she told, into lands unknown, against odds mighty, and all in the hope of love and salvation. This intrigued the debt collector, for no one had ever offered a thing quite like it. But even so, what if, after all was told, he felt it was not worth the sum owed? Then, she hoped, he would show her the same mercy any good person might give a desperate soul. To which he just smirked, and said nothing other than for her to tell the story. She told the tale of a man in search of the love he wronged, which all sounded tiresome, but he gave her the chance to make a fool of herself. This traveller found himself in a strange town, where everyone was lost and living at the limits of life. There he was offered a wish, which, despite being a trap, was a hard thing to refuse. The debt collector had never been one for silly tales, but soon found himself caught up in the strange adventure. The traveller nearly fell to temptation, but found the strength within to resist, and in doing so, saved those trapped souls who needed release. What came next? A question that warranted only a smile in return, adding she would be willing to tell more if her circumstances hadn't changed by their next meeting. He was tempted to say no, but she had kept her side of the bargain, and he did want to hear more. Long after leaving her behind, that story remained with him, and all throughout the following week it distracted his thoughts as he went about his work. When it finally came time to return, it was almost a relief to find she was still in no position to pay. Never before had he contemplated doing anything of such a nature, and if it were ever discovered, then it would not bode well for him. The debt collector was certain, however, that he could get away with it, for there were ways of hiding such things. The traveller had moved along in his journey, though was still no closer to finding his love. He arrived at a town that thrived on the trade of human life, and was disgusted by all he saw, and wanted to stop it. However, it was all operated within the limits of the law he once helped create. He could do nothing and moved on, feeling hollow and broken. She had kept her part, and so again did not make payment, and this was how things continued. Over the following weeks and months, he would arrive to find she still could not pay, and so received the next part of the story in recompense. The path the traveller walked was by no means easy, and the stories told were often not happy, but this appealed to the debt collector. In a way, it mirrored life, and so did not pander to childish fantasy. All during this time, he and the woman never became close. She never invited him in, or even asked his name. This was purely a business arrangement, but even so, she one day asked what would happen once the story came to an end. Then, for her sake, he hoped she would once more be in a position to repay her debt with money. They would always go through the same pretense. He would ask her for what was due, and in turn she would tell him more, until a day came when all that changed. Instead of saying no, she offered what had been left wanting so long. She denied him the rest of her story, and for weeks was ready, waiting with the money in hand. It plagued his thoughts and threatened to drive him mad. Eventually, he could stand no more, and found himself back at her door, demanding to know how the story ended. But she refused him. He could pay, an offer to which she just laughed. Anything, a most desperate plea was issued. Anything, came the question in return, giving the barest of hopes, before she asked him to write off her debt completely. That, however, was not within his power, and so she told him that unless he was willing to take it on himself, he would never know the end. He hesitated, but ultimately it was just too much to bear, and so agreed. She was surprised, maybe not expecting him to act as he did, but despite his word on the matter, was not prepared to trust, and so the debt was signed over officially before the last steps of that long journey were told. After walking that endless road, the traveller found the love he so terribly wronged, but though finding the forgiveness he so desperately sought, she was ultimately lost to him. The journey had made him into who he needed to be, but the path that lay ahead was his alone. The debt collector was broken, for it was not the end he had hoped for. But then rarely does a story ever go the way we want or desire it. And with it finally done, the woman told him to leave and closed the door. Now a debt collector cannot be indebted himself. It opens up the position to question, and, no longer above reproach, he found himself without work for the first time in his life. It was never a job that had made him rich, and with the reputation he once so willingly encouraged, no one was prepared to help. His debts mounted up, spiralling out of control, until at last he understood what it was like to be on the other side, with desperate pleas falling upon unsympathetic ears, until there was nothing left to give. Nothing but a story. Thank you for listening. And if you have enjoyed this story, please feel free to like, comment, and even follow for more.